I'm Patsy. Standing in the middle of a 4th of July barbecue, surrounded by 30-odd relatives, I was confronted by my father, Victor. He was a few beers in, his face flushed, and his words slurred. "You know you were an accident, right?" "I wanted a son," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter and laughter. The yard fell silent. Aunt Grace dropped her paper plate, and the potato salad spilled onto the grass. Everyone turned to look at me, their eyes wide with shock. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope.
"Funny," I said.
"Mom told me something different before she died. Want me to read her letter?" My father's hand started to shake. That letter held the truth he had buried for years, a truth that would shatter the lies he had told about my mother, about me, and about the house he claimed as his own. Let me take you back a few years to the start of this mess. I grew up in a small town in a big old house on Elm Street. It was a beautiful place, with a wraparound porch and a large backyard filled with my mother's hydrangeas. My mother, Lily, was a gentle soul. She spent her days taking care of the house and the garden, always putting everyone else's needs before her own. My father, Victor, was a different story. He was a domineering man who believed he was in charge of everything. He had a favorite chair in the living room, a worn-out leather recliner, and no one else was allowed to sit in it. He controlled the thermostat, the TV remote, and the family finances. My mother never had her own bank account and had to ask him for money for groceries every week. I was about 15 when I realized that our family wasn't like others. I spent a weekend at a friend's house and watched her mother make decisions without asking anyone's permission. It was then that I understood how much control my father had over my mother. One day, when I was 17, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a devastating blow to our family. My father, instead of being there for her, spent most of his time in the garage, working on his old Ford Mustang. I was the one who took her to her chemotherapy appointments, sat with her in the waiting room, and helped her when she was too weak to get out of bed. During those difficult months, my mother and Aunt Grace grew closer. They would have long phone calls and spend hours in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I later learned that they were planning something. My mother passed away in the winter. It was a cold and lonely day, and I felt like my heart had been ripped out. My father, on the other hand, seemed to move on quickly. A few months later, he introduced me to his new girlfriend, Stella. She was a real estate agent, and she had a sharp tongue and a calculating look in her eyes. One Sunday after dinner, my father slid a manila folder across the table to me. "Just some paperwork for your mother's estate," he said. "Sign where the tabs are and we'll be done with it." I was exhausted from work and grieving for my mother, so I signed most of the pages without reading them. I got to the last page, a quitclaim deed, but then my pager went off. I had to go to the hospital for an emergency. I told my father I'd finish signing it later. A few weeks later, I went back to the house on Elm Street to pick up some of my mother's things. When I walked in, I noticed something was different. The house smelled of a new perfume, and there were new pictures on the walls. I went upstairs to my mother's bedroom and found that Stella had moved in. My mother's things were gone, replaced by Stella's clothes and makeup. I was about to leave when I saw a folder on the coffee table. It was a real estate analysis for the house on Elm Street. The estimated value was high, and I realized that my father was trying to sell the house. That's when I knew I had to do something. I took the quitclaim deed and drove straight to Aunt Grace's house. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. When I told her what was going on, she wasn't surprised. She sat me down at the kitchen table and showed me a stack of papers. "Your mother bought this house with an inheritance from her parents," she said. "The deed is in her name, not your father's. And she made a will, leaving the house to you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All these years, my father had been lying to me. He had made me believe that the house was his, when in fact it was mine. Aunt Grace then gave me a sealed envelope. "Your mother wrote this for you," she said. "She told me to give it to you when you needed it." I held the envelope in my hands, my heart pounding. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I waited until I was alone in my car. When I finally did, I read my mother's words, her truth. She told me how much she loved me, how she had always wanted me, and how my father had never been ready to be a father. She also wrote about the house and the trust she had set up for me. A week later, my father called me, inviting me to the 4th of July barbecue. He said the whole family would be there and that I should bring the signed paperwork. I told him I'd be there, but I wouldn't be bringing the signed deed. I'd be bringing my mother's letter. And so here I was standing in the yard, facing my father and the rest of the family. I took a deep breath and began to read my mother's letter. As I read, the truth came out, and the lies my father had told were exposed. He tried to interrupt me, to grab the letter, but I wouldn't let him. I was finally standing up for myself and for my mother. In the end, my father had nothing left to say. The house was mine, and the trust my mother had set up would ensure my future. I learned that day that boundaries are important, and it's okay to say no to someone who has been controlling you. My mother may have been silent in life, but her letter spoke volumes.